I'm going to say hi and welcome to the Adversity Psychologist Podcast. I'm really excited because I've managed to meet now one of my idols. Would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us who you are and what's brought you on today.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Tara. Honestly, right back at you. And I'm so glad we're doing this. So I'm Dr. Ally Jaffee. I'm a Psychiatry Resident doctor and I work in the NHS, and I've been working as a doctor for the last 4 years. But I'm also a mental health advocate with lived experience of mental illness, and fell into a clinical depression halfway through medical school. And I aim to educate around stigma and shame by openly talking about my experience online and supporting a lot of doctors' mental health charities. And I've got a huge passion for holistic interventions in mental health. So the two hats I wear with that is I'm co-founder of a non-for-profit called Nutritank, which I started with my co-founder, Dr. Ian Broadley, in medical school. And we're all about educating healthcare professionals and healthcare students around nutrition and lifestyle interventions to prevent, manage, and sometimes even prevent chronic conditions. And I'm big on getting this into psychiatry practice as well. So how can we talk more about diet and lifestyle to help manage the symptoms of mental illness, but also help mitigate the side effects of the psychiatric medications, which we know can really disrupt metabolic health. And so then the second part of why I'm passionate about holistic interventions, especially around mental health, is I'm a trustee of a youth mental health grant giving charity called Chimo Trust. And so we fund charities across the UK who have unique holistic interventions to help young people alleviate mental health symptoms. And so we support charities who have surfing therapy, equine therapy, nature therapy, non-contact boxing therapy, art therapy, drama therapy, you name it. And we're really trying to build a case that community care is so important and social prescription is so important. And so that's kind of me in a nutshell.
So much to talk about. So I followed you online for ages because you just do so much incredible stuff, but we're quite aligned, aren't we? So I also run a not-for-profit. I'm really big on the kind of mind-body link, not trying to pigeonhole people too much in terms of how they manage their mental health. So I was so pleased to be able to get you on so we can talk a little bit more about it. But one of the other things that you do that I would love to start with is supporting the mental health of doctors and kind of post-pandemic, the pressure that people are under, and also the fact that perhaps I feel it's a demographic who may not feel that they can reach out as easily, that there's some stigma and shame still around managing your mental health as a professional, and kind of what got you into supporting people, if you're comfortable telling us a little bit about your story and what you do for others now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an open book, but it took me a long time to get there in terms of being able to share. And I always start off by saying I have chosen to share my story publicly, and there is no pressure on anyone to ever do that. It's just what felt right for me. So I got interested in doctors' mental health when I experienced my own bout of clinical depression halfway through medical school. I'd always wanted to specialize in psychiatry, and I kind of had this mindset of real fascination in it from a clinician to patient perspective. And I never really considered that anything like that would happen to me. Kind of the classic story. And I had experienced anxiety and was able to kind of label that, but it was quite high functioning. And then halfway through medical school, I experienced a really big dip in my mood. And there was a trigger that I had, there was a traumatic event, but it was one of those things where I truly believe it was always going to happen, because the way I was operating in terms of my psychological system was not healthy, had quite maladaptive coping mechanisms, emotional eating, and also just a very negative, berating internal critic, which I'd never worked through. So it happened, and I was able to get the right help, and I can talk a little bit more about that, and work closely with getting back to medical school and the faculty and blah, blah, blah. But after that experience, when I actually made it back to medical school, because there was a time I wasn't sure I would be able to, was when I realised, okay, I was quite secretive actually in the beginning with my housemates. I never would say I was going to my therapist. I always said, I don't remember what I said, but I didn't say I was going to my therapist. But eventually, slowly but surely, a light went off in me saying, if it could happen to me, and I know other people that it happened to, and more severe diagnoses, and for instance, eating disorders where it's very visible.
Yes.
But obviously, something like depression, anxiety can sometimes be silent. But I did just have this kind of spark thinking, well, if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. I want to work in psychiatry. How can I be stigmatizing towards myself? Am I then being stigmatizing towards my patients? It just didn't sit well with me. It was an internal conflict, and it felt right for me to be open and for me to be vulnerable. It really took a long time for me to get there, as I hid my emotions as much as I could throughout medical school and was unbelievably ashamed. Like, I remember being on placement in second year and I had a panic attack in my room, and I didn't feel like I could tell anyone, even though there were some really nice people I could have. It took a really long time to kind of get to that stage of, I actually really want to open up about my experience, share it with my housemates first, and then go more publicly to social media. And I just wasn't bothered in my year group at medical school who knew, who didn't, blah, blah, blah. Was very open for people to ask me questions and discuss it. And so that was kind of the start of it. So I just set up a social media profile and just started posting snippets of my story, and then got involved with doctors' mental health charities, who I now still support. So NHS Practitioner Health and Doctors in Distress. And they do absolutely wonderful work to really get this subject into the mainstream. And it's getting into the mainstream because the September Medical Journal was about doctors' suicide rates being at an all-time high, and how are we not doing more? And that was a very eloquent title that I can't remember. The fact that it was front and center of the BMJ was such incredible groundwork around how far we've come from this idea of covering the fact that carers need care too, and that they are patients as well. So I was very pleased to see that. It's very stark and upsetting, as the stats are terrible, with doctors diagnosed with suicide every 3 weeks and a nurse every week. However, if you don't talk about it and open it up to the surface, the action and policy and the interventions for support do not get executed. So it's a start. So yeah, that's my long-winded journey of how I kind of came involved in this space, but it's the space that I feel probably most strongly about.
And it's so, so important, isn't it? So that is one of probably many, many examples where people have stepped outside their comfort zone to talk about it, but it makes change. And I'm just wondering, even just that simple first step of talking to housemates, how much that must have resonated with them, how much it might have allowed other people to begin to share. And that's how it works, isn't it? You know, I'm not a massive fan of the kind of word normalizing conversations, but it does work. And we don't talk about it enough. And it's such a big point. I'm hoping people will take that away from the podcast today, that people who are in caring professions, they absolutely need that care too.
Yeah.
And we can sometimes forget that. There can be a bit of, as a psychologist myself, this kind of preconception that we will use all the strategies that we know and that we're infallible, but we're really not. And it's okay. We don't need to be. Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess coming off the back of that, in terms of your journey, because you're really into holistic care, I absolutely love that, especially when we kind of think of kind of medical models. Sometimes people have misconceptions, don't they, about psychology and psychiatry and the way that we work, and how mental health services work. Did you find, as part of your kind of recovery, your journey, that kind of holistic model of care was helpful for you?
Absolutely, 1000%. And what I always say is, this is how I've rationalized how I recovered, because it can be such a non-linear process in mental health recovery, and it can be very trial and error. But the way I rationalize what worked for me is, I imagine myself as drowning out at sea, and I was sinking, and my head was essentially really starting to drop below the surface that could lead to drowning. And going to my GP as the first point of call was by far the most important step to get to the rest of the steps. And so that initial going to the GP, talking to her, not feeling her judgment, which I had all these preconceptions in my head. Oh my gosh, a doctor saying medical student. I thought she'd say, oh, how are you going to cope? And None of that was all made up in my head. And I was also really against initially going on an antidepressant and had a lot of stigma around that.
Yes.
I realized it was the right thing to do for me because I had tried talking therapy first and was so brain dead with so much cognitive fog and to be honest, suicidal ideation as well, that it was really not appropriate for me to be in therapy at that time because I wasn't clinically ready. It just felt more palatable than going on medication. So anyways, what I say is going on medication and seeing my GP was like being thrown that life jacket where I was able to actually get my head above the water and bob and not drown anymore, but to actually swim back to shore, to land where I can thrive and move forward with my life, with my goals.
Absolutely.
And what's important to me. All those means to actually get back to shore were the holistic interventions. So getting back into a sleep routine, because as we know with depression, you get early morning waking, insomnia, and that was a huge problem with me. And I got very addicted to sleeping pills that were completely futile and all of that. And then also nutrition, which we'll go on to talk about more, was huge for me. I was already very interested in nutrition before, but I don't think specifically ate for brain health in mind, and so those changes really helped for me. And then creativity, so being able to express myself, especially when there's so many words just completely muddled in my head. And for me, I do that through poetry. People have other ways, drawing, etc. That was a huge part of my healing process, and I still use that now as an outlet, as well as movements such as yoga and social connection, because I'd socially withdrawn quite a lot. So all those holistic interventions, as well as nature and others that I have not mentioned, were absolutely essential for me to swim back to shore and actually get back to thriving rather than surviving.
That eclectic nature. So I'm so glad that you said about the psychological therapy, actually, because I've been practicing nearly 25 years, and there are times when I have seen people, and we've had to have that conversation, that they're not in the right place for therapy, and sometimes that's been met with understanding, but other times there can be misunderstanding that you're kind of rejecting, but you have to be in the right cognitive. Sometimes people, as you say, there's kind of the brain fog, you're not able to think, and that's where other interventions may be necessary. And it's not about a kind of a black or white medication or therapy. It's about looking at the research base, looking what fits for you. And I'm so glad that you brought that in, but also that those things are not just things to use in isolation, that moving your body, the massive link between mind and body. So I run walk and talk sessions in my local area. Just a simple left-right movement of your feet can help you process your emotions more efficiently, make better decisions, and connection as well. And we don't have to overthink that stuff, because I'm just thinking, when you're talking about the brain fog, how easy was it to start to think about, how do I connect again? How do I even get to a yoga class or access yoga? Because sometimes those decisions can feel really overwhelming for people.
Completely. And you get that decision paralysis, which I had hugely, because I'm a very high functioning person, and I'm passionate about education and probably have a bit of a productivity complex, which I'll continue to work on. But when I was depressed, I couldn't wash my hair. I couldn't make myself breakfast. I couldn't send an email off to my university to explain what was going on because I couldn't formulate the sentences. Overthought everything. I genuinely couldn't do the most basic tasks because of the cognitive fog and lack of self-belief and all the doubt that I had internally. And actually, my biggest issue physiologically, well, my two biggest issues, and we never really talk about the physical symptoms of depression. Gosh, I actually had way more than two big issues, but the issues I had were body aches, insomnia, and I had chronic bladder pain, which was something I'm still working through that. And because, obviously mind body, that was where my psychosomatic manifestation happened. It can happen in people's guts, like we know with anxiety and IBS, but for whatever reason, my bladder's my Achilles heel. Maybe as a psychologist, you can tell me why. I don't know.
But it's really helpful that you share that, because sometimes that's where things might get missed, because people are looking for these kind of stereotypical of what we see on social media.
I mean, I went to
not looking
loads of urologists as well before I realized my mind was kind of doing it and all of that. But And then eating, I really lost my appetite and lost a fortune of weight. So those were my physical symptoms of the depression. And then how did I even get to be able to realize that holistic interventions were something I could do? Because for a while they weren't.
Yes.
It was actually going on the medication. So when I went on the medication, I viewed it as not only a safety jacket, but I viewed it as a physiological recalibrator. So within 3 weeks, I genuinely was sleeping again. And that was my biggest step. So the sleep then led to, okay, I can think a little bit more clearly. Okay, I have the strength to exercise, move. And okay, I will maybe have the energy for a conversation with 1 or 2 people to do an activity. Like
those small little steps.
The smallest things. So it was a graded approach where I do believe that, because we use, as you know, the biopsychosocial model when looking at recovery, I do believe I had to really sort out the biological symptoms of the depression, and the biological intervention of the medication worked for me. It doesn't work for everyone. Antidepressants aren't effective on everyone. We know that from the data, but they did help me get to that initial stage of the brain fog lifting, the insomnia improving, and saying, okay, what can I do next? Maybe I'm ready to start talking therapy.
And just for me, showing that pathway, I love a pathway, that it doesn't have to be the same for everybody. Because sometimes, again, I think, if we're overwhelmed, if we have that brain fog, sometimes it's really hard to know what you need yourself, because you can get really hooked on, I should be doing this by now, or this should be working, or everyone else seems to do this and their depression gets better. And I see that so much in my own clinic room, that kind of person-centered model, and being okay with that. And that sometimes it's only tiny steps. So we can get really hooked, can't we, in these big quick fixes. Or there may be external pressures. You've got a job where you're signed off for a couple of weeks and then suddenly you're back in it.
Yeah.
We might,
my pressure was get better to get back to medical school for September, and everything went wrong with me in March, April time of 2019. So that was what was kind of pushing me to try and really, with all the will, even though sometimes you can have no will, no matter how much you want it, but that was what was in my foresights.
So that kind of that lived, because I'm thinking as well as a clinician, and during my career things have really shifted. So when I trained, you kind of program really, you don't talk about yourself, it's all about the person in the room with you or the person you're working with. And I love the fact that culture is starting to change, and people are sharing, as appropriate, their lived experience, showing that they're human as various clinicians. And I absolutely love that, because I think it starts more conversations, but also with our colleagues. There's still a little bit of shame and stigma in psychology about talking about having lived experience of mental health or not doing so well. But we're starting to break down those barriers, aren't we? But also, I'm not sure that every clinician is also really good at remembering the mind-body link stuff that they know. So what's really lovely about you coming on is that you're able to kind of say, we need to think really holistically. And you co-founded something called Nutritank. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because that's one of the first things that I saw that interests me and about your work.
Absolutely. So Nutritank really is a labour of love, and is mine and Dr. Ian Broadley's brainchild. So we met at Bristol Medical School, and we were both really passionate about holistic healthcare from kind of just our own personal experience and how we were brought up, both with kind of foreign parents who had different kind of more outdoorsy lifestyles than the British lifestyle. So we were really interested in kind of what goes beyond the biomedical model, and really interested in food, both being just passionate about eating. And so we started medical school and realized that nutrition and lifestyle advice is genuinely not touched upon in medical school.
Which is just unbelievable, really, isn't it, when you think about that?
So we were expecting, our expectations just were totally not met. We were expecting to actually learn about it, considering when you look at the NICE guidelines, for every chronic condition, first line management is diet and lifestyle advice needing to be offered, whether it's polycystic ovarian syndrome, high blood pressure, you name it. And we were just really shocked that we were really never taught about it. So we did some research and digging, realized it wasn't an issue with our medical school, it was a systemic issue, and not just in the UK, but in all westernized health systems, that we go to a pill for every ill, a reactive approach, a pharmacological intervention over anything else first, because that's where all the research is, that's where all the funding is. There are a lot of socio-political kind of reasons. go into, but we knew that this was shocking, considering the Lancet put out a huge study showing that poor diet is the leading cause of death and mortality worldwide. And so if we know that it's responsible as one of the prime factors for chronic disease progression, how are we not doing more to educate the future workforce?
Yes.
So that's when we realized we needed to do something to fill this educational gap, created Nutritank, and essentially worked with other professionals and groups that were big in this space and came before us. It's always brilliant to collaborate with others and not have that kind of weight on your shoulders. I have to do this alone. And others have been at this argument for a while longer than us, so stand on the shoulders of giants. And so we worked with organizations like NEDPro, and we created an interprofessional working group to discuss nutrition and how it can be implemented into undergraduate medical school curricula. Then off the back of that, we were able to work with the Association for Nutrition, which is the regulatory body for registered nutritionists in this country. And they were essentially tasked by the General Medical Council, the GMC, who regulate doctors in this country, to create a gold standard nutrition curricula with this interprofessional working group. So it was ourselves as medical students and NEDPro and other organizations in the space, as well as members of multiple Royal Colleges. And we essentially created this gold standard nutrition curriculum that was launched in October 2021. And now that has been sent to all different medical schools. And whilst there is not kind of, it was a really big achievement and milestone for all of us involved. And whilst it's not completely compulsory for medical schools to implement every aspect of it, because every specialty has their gold standard curriculum. You can only implement so much when there's curriculum crowding. Most medical schools now have far more representation, and there really are some brilliant medical schools now leading the way with dietitians represented on the medical school faculty. And we also then were able to work with Jamie Oliver, which was another wonderful milestone, and he really our work and helped us create a campaign called Nutrition for Medics. And that led to being on telly with him and working with his public health campaigns team to lobby for a commitment to greater nutrition education for frontline NHS staff to be added into the 2019 NHS long-term plan, which it was. So we're really proud of the implementation and educational framework work.
It's incredible,
be part of, but there's still a very, very long way to go. And it's, as you know, unfortunately, it's very hard to have standardized change because, as we know, it's every trust, they're their own entity, every medical school is their own entity. So change comes trickling in with others leading the way. And I'd love to have a league table to really incentivize and name and shame, but
kind of Premier League of medical schools, because this isn't just about how clinicians work with people and bring in nutrition, but also because I think that's one of the first things I saw. You did a social media post once with a sandwich kind of saying, look, we're doing all this work to educate the people we work with, but look what we have in the canteen to eat. Ages ago, wasn't it? And I think that's something that really caught my attention, of kind of who's looking after you guys.
It was a while ago I posted about it, but presently I'm actually working on a research project looking at the impact of the occupational food environment on junior doctors' health, well-being and productivity. And so I'm working with a dietitian and two fellow clinicians on this research project, and we managed to collect data from over 400 doctors, and we have got data from their canteens from all over the country to show who's doing well with provisions for doctors in hours and out of hours, and who's falling short, and what impact does that have on the doctor, especially out of hours. So I'm really dumbfounded by how atrocious, I really can't mix my words with it and be polite, but the hospital food environment is a joke. It's absolutely ridiculous that a place of healing has that percentage of ultra processed food and chain coffee shops with very poor brown and beige options for meals.
And again, so we can link that into all that fabulous work, and we're both on the same page when we look at kind of preventative stuff. So sometimes you may have a mental health crisis and you need something in that moment. But, and I'm a huge advocate for this, that we don't want to just live life waiting for things to come our way. We need to be doing preventative stuff. And that kind of reminds me of that kind of model of, if you're tired, overworked, it's 3 a.m, you're going to grab what there is. And what do we tend to do? And what do we learn about our bodies? Most of us are grabbing carbs, sugary, quick fix things. What does that then do an hour later in terms of our blood sugar? And so the cycle repeats. And how can we have adequate cognition, hydration when we are just eating rubbish? And the options are there. And we all know, when you think about how your frontal lobes function, you're just going to grab stuff when you're tired. We're not going to have that lovely clear thoughts of what we should need, and then even if we do, where is it to go get it? And that's the same as well. I have a kind of an interesting moment of people who work at home still, who are just sat at desks grabbing what they can in between Teams or Zoom calls, and that kind of, so how can we in a nutshell, how can we start getting, even as people listen to this podcast, to start thinking about preventative well-being, from what they eat to how they move their bodies? Because some people just think, oh, it's a chore. And I get that a lot with the people that I work with. How do we get people to, even if it's just a tiny seed of hope, to think more about putting that effort in and being preventative?
Macro speaking, I think it's really important to just state that a lot of the time, the media will put individual blame on people for making poor food choices, and then
such a good point.
Them for chronic disease. And that's why it's really
shaming.
It's really challenging with the obesity epidemic at the moment, and weight stigma, which I'm really interested in. And it's also really challenging with doctors, healthcare professionals, and influencers online who are just all about lifestyle and not really seeing the nuance with the need for traditional medications and because when we say, I'm huge on nutrition, but when we say food is medicine too much, I don't mind it being thrown around a little bit. It's just a phrase, but when you actually unpick what it means, if you say food is medicine, then you are actually implying that it is the individual's fault that they've ended up the way they are. And if they ate the right food, they'd be healed. So it's really crucial when you ask that question, to just state that if you can't be bothered and you feel like it's a chore, there's still that element of self-compassion, and let's not call people lazy.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to make that point. But on the more kind of macro level as well, I think it's a huge thing that the environments that people work in, schools, hospitals, care homes, whatever, trains, we know that they have a lot of ultra processed food and poor options. So again, you just can't blame the individual when there's no provision of the healthier choice. So I think then when you do look at what can the individual do to better be prepared when the food environments are toxic and unhelpful, is it does come down to being prepared and
having time to do it, making time.
And you have to also question what difference would it make to them in their immediate day-to-day life if they made these changes. So I'm a big believer in meeting people where they're at and finding meaningful activities that perhaps they can no longer do, and trying to use motivational interviewing around lifestyle changes so that they can re-engage in those activities. So say they like to swim in their youth and they no longer can swim because of whatever, it's how can you if for reasons of they find it embarrassing to be in a swimsuit or whatever, how can you ease them back into that? Second of all, if they're a young dad and they've put on loads of weight because they're a truck driver and they live a sedentary lifestyle and they're always eating petrol station, ultra processed food on the go because there is nothing else, and they're upset that they can no longer lift their child up and play with
all the value-based living stuff, isn't it?
Like that's, there we go, that's far more eloquent. So that's what I kind of try and say, well, what's meaningful to you to make the changes? Because otherwise people don't want, it does feel like a chore if there's no real meaningful output other than aesthetics. And a lot of patients don't find the parameters of cholesterol and HbA1c and things
Yes.
we find meaningful. So you have to, what are their parameters they find meaningful, these values, these activities. So I evaluate all of that first. And then once they have a kind of goal and a why as to why they want to make these changes, then I start to say, okay, well, have you thought about some simple swaps? So if you're having spaghetti bolognese however many times a week, do you think you could swap from the refined carbohydrate pasta, so white pasta, to the whole wheat option? And at Lidl, Aldi, wherever you're shopping, there is that availability. It's very popular, and it's a high fiber.
And it's just a small change, isn't it, for a bigger gain?
Right. Likewise, white rice
Yes.
to brown rice, and an addition mindset rather than a restriction mindset. So, okay, you're having that spag bowl, absolutely fine. I'm not trying to make you vegan tomorrow. And I also think that if anyone wants to eat meat, they must, continue how they please, but with, just mindfulness around moderation. But I would never say to someone who, especially 80-year-olds who have grown up on meat, oh, just stop eating it overnight. So how can you add more veggies in and add more of the plant-loving foods our gut and brains love? So why not add mushrooms into the bolognese, spinach, herbs and spices, and lentils and whatever to kind of bulk it up, rather than thinking I need a whole new vegan recipe, a whole new vegan recipe book. And so those kind of basic principles, and talking about adding diversity and eating the rainbow and adding more color, I think can really just nudge people into the right direction and think that actually it's quite simple and not overcomplicated and just
manageable, therefore,
and making it cheap, talking about the benefits of frozen fruits and vegetables, how actually frozen fruits and vegetables are unbelievably nutritious. They're picked at the prime time, then they're frozen, they're cheaper. You don't have to think about, oh my gosh, are they going to go off or not? You could literally grab brown rice. This is what I did last night. I grabbed a salmon fillet that was in the freezer, edamame beans that were in the freezer, peas that were in the freezer. I boiled some brown rice. I stirred up a little soy chili sauce and then fried that brown rice and the veggies from the freezer, put them in, and boom, it was done for my work lunch today. Not saying everyone can still access what I did, but I'm just making the example.
But it's a really good everyday example. Sometimes our brains can overthink what that's going to be like. And then that's where the roadblocks are. That sometimes, even these days, mental health can sometimes become a chore. You must do, you should do. There's a lot of loaded language, isn't there, on social media? So I think what it's really lovely is you're super busy to hear you say that. You managed to do that. And
yeah, I mean, I don't manage to do it every night. I've got a husband who loves to cook and a mom who loves to cook. And I will say I have a lot of cooking support.
Which is also okay. Yeah.
So I won't, big myself up that I cook every night, because I don't. And some nights I will have a takeaway. And I believe strongly in the principle of 80-20. Let's not blame ourselves for having a bad food day. Let's not add moralistic language around worse of food choices. And let's just remember that our guts and our brains want an overall good dietary pattern, say over a month. So if you have, a few days here and there in a month where you're eating ultra processed food, having the cookies from the NHS trolley with your fellow staff members, birthday cake, blah, 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 so be it. It really isn't going to make an overall difference. And the stress of restricting can be worse for your gut health than actually eating the things itself in moderation.
That's such a good point, isn't it? That actually sometimes those pressures and stress and sometimes it is really hard. Sometimes actually it's quite good for our mood to kind of go, oh, it's someone's birthday, let's have a piece of cake with them, and allow ourselves that. But it's just catching yourself if that's happening more and more often, if there are other things then that are falling by the wayside. And I love that just what's the overall picture. It's already given us kind of permission to breathe a little bit, hasn't it? I think that's something people can really take away. I'm going to steal that. Just what does the month look like? Because you can get really hooked up in the here and now, can't you? And shaming.
If we think the picture, we can be a lot kinder to ourselves. But if we focus on the minutiae of it was a bad day, and I think, and then it's like, also, how can we define ourselves by a day? Like, you're so much more than just a bad day.
Absolutely.
Failure because I didn't eat well or exercise today. You're so much more than a day in terms of self-esteem and identity.
And it's so easy for that stuff to snowball. I am, that kind of more rule-bound global language. I am, rather than today, this happened. I got a little bit hooked and I grabbed that starchy, carby croissant from the cafe or whatever it is. That kind of, one thing I guess I'm going to take away from today is just being more compassionate about how we look after I'm going to say well-being, because we talked about mental health, physical health, the interplay between the two. And what I also love is when you bring in that lived experience, you're also tackling a lot of shame there as well. So I think what you've got there is a really wonderful thing, because you've got the mind meets the body meets lived experience. Because I do sometimes struggle when we kind of have this kind of, clinicians are on this pedestal sometimes, and sometimes the people that we work with, I think there's a bit of a power imbalance. And what I really love is when things are collaborative. So perhaps clinicians being a bit more vulnerable, sharing our stories, I think really helps to make a bit of a shift. And I know my patients love it when I say, hey, there's some days where I totally avoid things, or, bury my head in the sand. I'm human. There are days when I eat stuff, or I've drunk alcohol and I was going to have a day without. It just makes us human, but it also helps us to kind of catch, right, what am I going to do with this? As a psychologist, I like to look for patterns. This happening more and more often, and what might that mean? In terms of kind of moving forward, where do you see yourself going in terms of getting messages out? Because you do so much, don't you? And there's so many offshoots to what you do. What is your kind of aim?
It's a really good question, and something I have been reflecting on quite a lot recently. And I think for me, variety is the spice of life and what makes me feel balanced. And it's not for everyone, but leading a portfolio career is how I see myself being able to keep stimulated and fulfilled. What that looks like is being somewhat in the NHS, because I would always want to kind of have experience of what's going on the ground, but I don't see myself being a full-time psychiatrist in the future because of many issues that I've heard from full-time psychiatrists, let's just say. And I also want to be able to take my skill set out of the clinical room and out of the small percentage that actually get to mental health services, especially in services. And really take that skill set to the masses from the prevention public health perspective. And through that, would love to be writing books, delivering talks, and working with brands on how to make their companies more mental health informed. Likewise with corporate schools, etc. So that's kind of where I see, where I hope my career goes, is that I'm very macro inclined, but I love individual one-to-one time with a patient. So I would never want to lose that, but I'm aware that I don't think I can personally be working in the NHS every single day of my life, because I don't think it would be good for me. And I don't think I would be putting my skills, which I'm proud of to have developed, to their potential, essentially, if I'm not out there in the public as well. So we'll see how that goes, but that's the kind of hope. And I love creativity as well, and I really hope that I can one day write a play, as that would be the dream.
Oh wow, that would be fantastic.
Because I just think that arts can really convey such important messages around health and psychosocial issues, and to the masses in a much more palatable way than an NHS leaflet about depression. So that's the dream.
And a poetry-based mental health.
We'll see how that goes, but
So I've had loads of nuggets. I could talk to you all day. I'm going to have to get you back on again. Have a few people who've been on multiple times. If there was one little adversity takeaway, that's kind of my signature move, one thing that you could leave us with, what would it be?
What would it be? What would it be? Oh my gosh. Okay. I guess this is my takeaway. And it's something that I have to work on a lot, and probably have been falling down on it recently. But I say to myself quite often that you can't be everything to the world and nothing to yourself.
Yes.
And
I love that.
My takeaway would be that passion and purpose is absolutely crucial and incredible. And, serving others, that is something that really lights me up. Community, collaboration, serving others. But if you can't serve yourself effectively, then you will end up being no use to others, and your light will get dimmed. And you know, the whole you can't pour from an empty cup and blah blah blah.
I think that's why I love that, because you said it again, that reality of I don't always do it, and that will resonate with a lot of people.
I mean, absolutely. I'm really still trying to figure out my new routine. I've been back in full-time NHS for the last 2 months, having done a year of not being full-time. And so I'm really trying to figure out how am I looking after myself day to day, and still just, working through it all.
Little things like working, coming straight on a podcast. What are you going to do after this? What's your little thing for you? Taking time to even think, what do I need? What do I need?
I'm going to wash my hair. That's, that's very important.
Small little things make a big difference.
Wash my hair, cook and read, and that is what I will be doing this evening. And kind
of just knowing that you matter enough to press pause and do those things. So if people want to find out more and they're going to want to, where do you hang out? And I will make sure all this is in the snow notes, of course, but where can we find you?
I'm on most social media platforms. I'm at Dr Ally Jaffee on Instagram, TikTok, X, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And I've got a website as well, www.drallyjaffee.com. And if you want to hear more about Nutritank, we run free CPD webinars every Monday evening for health.
Didn't know that. I'll hop on one.
On a range of subjects within nutrition and lifestyle medicine. We've done ADHD and sleep, and for instance, if you're mental health inclined. So check us out, www.nutritank.com. Our socials are also Nutritank on every platform as well. And that would be great.
Fantastic. I'll make sure all of that is in the show notes. It's so lovely to virtually meet you. Been an absolute pleasure.